Actually, this question doesn't even need to be asked, because it has long since been answered by the important German poet and writer Christian Morgenstern, who was born in Munich in 1871 and died in Murano in 1914. He also became famous for his highly recommended cheerful and grotesque poems, such as the Gallows Songs or those about Palmstrom. In his insight about the moon, he logically deduced, based on his knowledge of the German script, that the letters A, as in abnehmend, waning, and Zed, as in zunehmend, waxing, were written with a powerful flourish. When God created the dear moon, he gave it the following task, both when waxing and waning, to accommodate German readers, forming an A and a Z so that no one would have to think much about it. By following this, the satellite became a completely German object. But if this proof is not enough for someone, I refer them to the story Peter's Journey to the Moon, published in 1912 by Gert von Bassewitz, in which the Maybug Herr Sumsemann flies to the moon with the children Peter and Anneliese in search of his lost sixth leg, where, of course, everyone only speaks German. And another compelling piece of evidence is, of course, the film Munchausen, made in 1943, in which the famous Baron Hieronymus Karl Friedrich von Munchausen, also known as Hans Albers, flies to the moon with his servant Christian, where they were able to converse perfectly in German with the Moon Man and his wife. Finally, I refer the doubting people to Monday, July 21st, 1969. On that day, heat records of over 33 degrees in the shade were reported in Germany. At that time, however, this was not attributed to the so-called climate change, but, as in centuries before, to midsummer weather. And while the Germans themselves were sweating heavily in their beds at night on July 21st, 1969, at 3:56 a.m. German time, a spectacular, world-changing event took place. Almost 400,000 kilometers away from Germany, the 39-year-old American Neil Armstrong became the first human ever to step down from his lander Eagle, Adler in German, from the ladder onto the moon. And he said, "This is a small step for a man, but a giant leap for mankind." With that, the goal set 7 years earlier by President John F. Kennedy was achieved when he announced on May 25, 1961, the United States should commit itself to landing a man on the moon and returning him safely to Earth before the end of this decade. And on September 12, 1962, Kennedy clarified his statement once again at the university in Houston, Texas. "We have decided to go to the moon in this decade." After that, a gigantic program was launched. Just like the manned spaceflight project Artemis, launched in 2019 by NASA, back then a multi-billion-dollar funding was secured for the Apollo program, which was carried out by the NASA, the National Aeronautics and Space Administration. And now, those who came to the United States of America after the end of World War II, under the leadership of V2 rocket specialist Wernher von Braun, now German Americans, came back into the spotlight, all top-notch specialists in rocket engineering on whom Kennedy and the whole country now place their hopes. And without their specialized knowledge, the Apollo missions, including the first moon landing, almost certainly would not have been possible at all. The picture shows 104 German rocket specialists in 1945 as part of the Texas team led by Wernher von Braun. But when, according to American time, on July 20, 1969, it actually succeeded to transport humans to the moon, monitored from this room in the NASA Control Center in Houston, Texas, the person who took the first step on our satellite, as we have heard, bore the fine American name Neil Armstrong. After he then took his first walk for 20 minutes, the second person had also stepped onto the moon, Edwin Aldrin. But now, hold on tight, because you won't find this on Wikipedia. The second person on the moon, Buzz Aldrin, who was born with the first names Edwin Eugene, is actually descended from the Fischbach and Richter families, who came from Trupasch centuries ago, which has belonged to Siegen since 1966. They emigrated to what was then the British colony of Virginia in North America. And Buzz Aldrin is also a direct descendant of the German Reformed pastor Johann Heinrich Hager, who lived from 1644 to 1737. From Anshausen, a district of the municipality of Willensdorf, now in the Siegen-Wittgenstein district. He was admitted to the teaching faculty in Herborn in the Westerwald in April 1668, then taught at the Latin school in Hanau in 1669, and around 1678, he married Anna Katharina Friesenhagen in Siegen, where he worked as a teacher. From 1703 to 1711, he was then a pastor in Oberfischbach, west of Siegen, from where as early as 1709, members of the Lutheran Reformed Church had sailed from Rotterdam to New York. After Hager, the ancestor of Aldrin, who is standing here on the moon next to Armstrong, received permission on April 3, 1711, to retire from the pastorate for health reasons. He left Oberfischbach, which today belongs to the Rhineland district, in the summer of 1713, with his family and 12 other minor families, and also emigrated to the so-called New World. There he then served as pastor to the Germana colonists in Fort Germana, a German settlement in the British colony of Virginia. It had been supported by the British Lieutenant Governor Alexander Spotswood and then settled in 2 waves, first in the year 1714 and then in the year 1717, mainly by German miners who then established the silver mining industry in Virginia. Back in July 1969, as often happens with such fantastic achievements of human intelligence, I'm talking about the moon landing by Armstrong and Aldrin, some contemporaries quickly doubted it and dismissed it as a U.S. propaganda operation secretly staged by Hollywood against the Soviet Union. Just as the single-shooter theory and the assassination of John F. Kennedy on November 22, 1963, has been questioned by various sources and fueled with ever new motives and theories about how it happened. As for the total of 6 moon landings, during which 12 people set foot on our natural satellite between July 1969 and December 1972, and around 400,000 people were directly or indirectly involved. Even the competing Soviet Union never questioned these landings at the time. But as for the deadly assassination of President Kennedy, anyone can visit the crime scene in the Texas city of Dallas and form their own opinion after studying the numerous sources. Here at the yellow second cross was where the second shot at Kennedy took place in October 1963. From this building. And if I get closer now, you can see down here another yellow dot, or a yellow cross. That was the first shot that hit him. Here, from this building, which is a museum, it was unfortunately closed. He came from this street here. He drove over here, turned here, and there were people standing everywhere, as you could see in the films. That's where the first shot was fired. They kept driving. Until to this second one. That was the fatal one. That was just one shooter. When Kennedy made his announcement for a manned moon mission in 1962, right in the midst of the Cold War, One reason for it was that the Soviet Union had managed to launch the satellite Sputnik 1 into near space with an R-7 rocket on October 4, 1957, which meant that, practically overnight, they were ahead in the technological race. But with the launch of Sputnik into space, the Communist Soviet Union had also proven that it was now capable of reaching U.S. territory with intercontinental missiles. And as if the annoying beeping Sputnik satellite hadn't been enough of a nuisance for the Americans, to make matters worse, on April 12, 1961, with the Soviet cosmonaut Colonel Yuri Gagarin, a human was transported for the first time above the internationally recognized boundary of 100 kilometers. And again, on February 3, 1966, it was the Soviet Union that successfully completed the first soft landing of an object launched from Earth on the Moon, with Luna 9. And it was also the first to send a photo from the surface of another celestial body back to Earth. But then, 3.5 years later, Wernher von Braun's team actually managed to have 2 people walk on the Moon, including the descendant of German immigrants from the 17th century, Buzz Aldrin, and they were also brought safely back to Earth. But of course, that's still not enough to declare our natural satellite a completely German object in the sense of Christian Morgenstern. Therefore, I will now go back to the time before the capitulation of the Wehrmacht on May 8, 1945, when Germany was far ahead of competing countries in rocket research. Even if, for the time being, no German was supposed to be sent to the moon. Nevertheless, on June 20th, 1944, at the Army Research Center Peenemünde on the Baltic Sea, a German A-4 test rocket was successfully launched into space to a height of 176 kilometers, making it the first man-made object to reach space. But with the German defeat and the confiscation of the rocket weapons by the victors, the German rocket program, which had been far ahead of the others, now belonged to the past forever. Well, not quite, because behind every technological program, there are people, and at that time, they were by no means a thing of the past, but very much alive. Here you can see, on May 3, 1945, the German rocket specialists who had surrendered to the Americans in Tyrol the day before. With a hat and a cigar, Major General Walter Dornberger, Herbert Axter, Wernher von Braun, who had broken his arm in a car accident a month earlier. To his right, Hans Lindenberg. To take control of this invaluable human potential, von Braun in civilian clothes, intelligence programs had been launched in the United States of America, Great Britain, and also in the Soviet Union. Thus, on October 22, 1946, in Operation Soviakim, the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics deported more than 2,500 scientists, engineers, and technicians, along with around 4,000 of their family members for forced labor in the Soviet Union. Among them was also Helmut Gottrup, the former assistant of Wernher von Braun. Here is a later picture. When, on October 1947, at 10:47 Moscow time, the first Soviet tests of reconstructed V-2 rockets took place in Kapustin Yar, Helmut Gottrup and another dozen German engineers were involved. However, Gottrup, who had been accused by the Soviets of delaying deadlines and disloyalty, returned to East Germany in 1952 and fled to West Germany a year later with the help of Western agencies. There, among other groundbreaking developments, he invented the basic principle of the chip card with contactless data transmission. But the real mastermind behind rocket development in the Soviet Union was not a German, but the leading chief designer from Ukraine, Sergei Pavlovich Korolyov. His realized and initiated developments, such as the Soyuz rocket and the Soyuz spacecraft, are still used today in improved form. while the efforts of the British in recruiting German rocket scientists, or their technology with their Fedden mission and Operation Surgeon, remained limited. Here, they are testing a captured V-2 at Cuxhaven, while the Americans' involvement was enormous. They could entice using entirely different methods than the British or Soviets. They owed their victory over Germany largely to the unrestricted military and economic support of the United States of America. However, this support, as far as the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics was concerned, came to an abrupt end at the latest in April 1945, after the death of U.S. President Roosevelt, who had a strange connection with the Soviet dictator Stalin. Because after the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics occupied a good part of the Eastern European countries, against all agreements in order to install compliant governments in their own interest, even the most naive American foreign policy makers woke up from their dreams of a democratic Russia and adopted the views of the British Prime Minister Winston Churchill, that after the destruction of the German dictatorship, it was now time to tackle the Soviet one. In short, the Cold War had begun. So that the United States of America could secure an advantage over the Soviet Union in the emerging Cold War in space, 2 Western Allied intelligence operations had been launched. Operation Backfire, which aimed at immediate access to the technical know-how and operational handling of the German A-4 rocket technology, and Operation Overcast, which was intended to recruit German scientists and engineers immediately after the war in order to secure their military technical skills and knowledge for themselves. The often mentioned U.S. Project Paperclip in this context was the continuation of Overcast. When, according to German time, on July 21, 1969, Armstrong set foot on the moon, more than 100 engineers from Germany had also been involved in this spectacular, history-making achievement. Among them were the leading engineers Wernher von Braun and Kurt Heinrich Debus, under whose direction, among other things, the first moon landing had taken place. Seen here on September 11, 1962, during a briefing with U.S. President John F. Kennedy and Vice President Lyndon B. Johnson. Also Arthur Rudolph and Dr. Phil Hubertus Strughold, who is considered the father of space medicine. Until 1945, he was the chief physician of the German Air Force. Both Strughold, who died in Texas in 1986, and Rudolph, who died in Hamburg in 1996, were highly decorated several times for their work in the U.S. rocket and space program. Strughold also received the German Federal Cross of Merit in 1983. But then they were no longer needed in the United States of America, because the political goal, a propaganda victory over the Soviet Union, had been achieved. And since public interest in the moon landings had clearly waned, in the early 80s, American circles initiated investigations against the German engineers because of their past in the V-2 program. Forced laborers had also been used in this program, which led to awards being revoked and names being removed from the International Space Hall of Fame. Rudolph, here to the right of von Braun, even had to give up his American citizenship in 1984 under pressure. In 1945, things looked very different when the 2 just mentioned were brought from Germany to the United States of America as part of the intelligence operations Overcast and Paperclip, which were carried out until 1959. Together with more than 1,600 other German scientists, engineers, and technicians to work there as employees of the U.S. government. For their pragmatic American bosses during the Cold War, the past didn't matter, only the future as now American rocket engineers. Another prominent German in the U.S. moon program was the already mentioned Major General Walter Dornberger, who served as head of the Rocket Division of the Army Ordnance Office from 1936 to 1943, and from September 1942, he was responsible for the entire German rocket weapons program. This also included the development of the Fieseler 403, the so-called Flying Bomb V-1, and the V-2 rocket. The first successful V-2 test launch had already taken place on October 3, 1942, but it was deprioritized by the highest authorities. In 1947, after nearly 2 years of British captivity in Special Camp 11, engineer Dornberger went to the United States, where his ideas and projects ultimately led to the development of the Space Shuttle. In 1957, he and his team developed the air-to-surface missile rocket at Bell Aircraft Company. Later called the Guided Air Missile, 63 it was the world's first nuclear air-to-surface guided missile, developed for the Strategic Air Command. After he returned to Germany at the end of the 1960s, he advised the federal government on issues related to a European regular space program. The probably best-known German in the U.S. rocket and space program was the already repeatedly mentioned Dr. Phil Werner von Braun, who became technical director of the Army Research Center Peenemünde in 1937. Under his leadership, the first functional liquid-fueled rocket, Aggregate 4, was developed, which became known under its propaganda name, Vengeance Weapon V-2. Shortly before the end of the war, von Braun had secured the most important documents of German rocket research, so to speak as a bargaining chip for his negotiations with the Americans, whom he knew were already in a race with the Soviets to prevent the technologies developed by the Germans from falling into their hands. When von Braun then presented the Americans with a prospect of a flight to the moon in a report written in May to June 1945, they immediately took the bait, and they brought him, the chief designer of the feared V-2 rocket, to the American-occupied zone on July 19, 1945, and flew him to the United States of America on November 16, where from then on he enjoyed first-class treatment. And when he returned to Landshut in Bavaria for a few days for his wedding to Maria von Quistorp on March 1, 1947, he was strictly guarded by the Americans around the clock, as they feared he might be kidnapped to the Soviet Union. Like the lives of most other Germans before and after the war, Braun's life was also divided into two parts. Photos show him until April 1945 in the company of high-ranking German officers, while those from the following years show him together with U.S. presidents like Dwight D. Eisenhower, here also at the awarding of a U.S. medal to Braun. With John F. Kennedy, to whom he had presented his rocket several times, or with the animator Walt Disney, who made 3 educational films for television with him in the mid-1950s. However, whether Werner von Braun, seen here on the right as one of the NASA administration directors, actually saw all of this as major breaks in his life is highly questionable. Because for someone who was obsessed with rocket building in the positive sense, it had always been secondary for whom he was building rockets. You could also call that opportunism. After another 115 members of Braun's Peenemünde team were brought to the United States of America during the Cold War, and even in the early 60s, all department head positions at the Rocket Research Center in the Texas desert and later in Huntsville, Alabama, were held by Germans. Von Braun had continued his earlier work at the Army Ordnance Office so seamlessly and consistently that the Americans unofficially called his research center Peenemünde South. In 1953, his team in the United States of America developed the first ballistic missile, Redstone, based on the V-2, which could carry a nuclear warhead over a distance of 320 kilometers. And when, in 1957, Sputnik 1 was launched on an R-7 intercontinental missile, and the Americans had no equivalent launch vehicle, the U.S. Army and the government turned to von Braun's team to close the so-called missile gap. Just 1 year after Sputnik, on February 1st, 1958, amid the cheers of the project leaders, a Jupiter C rocket, the modified version of the Redstone derived from the V-2, was able to carry the first U.S. satellite, Explorer 1, into space. Later, von Braun, on the left in the picture, became the director of the Marshall Space Flight Center at NASA during the groundbreaking ceremony for a new building. And he developed the gigantic Saturn V rocket, which is displayed in a huge hall at the American Space Museum in Houston, Texas, with which, in July 1969, the two astronauts Armstrong and Aldrin were brought to the moon. Everything about this rocket is actually impressive, whether it's its length of 110 meters or the 5 huge F1 engines. You have to see this monster for yourself, its dimensions, to realize what kind of genius was behind its development. So far, I have introduced you to the large number of German engineers and scientists who played a significant role in the quasi-conquest of the moon. In addition, there is also a considerable number of Americans with German roots who have flown as astronauts in the Apollo program or with the Space Shuttle. I once researched the names of astronauts whose German heritage can be proven. There is also something remarkable in connection with the Space Shuttle, which was based on the ideas of Walter Dornberger. Because of its reusability, it was supposed to save money, and that's why, after its landings, it was always flown back to the launch site for new missions on that original Boeing 747. Although not everyone may know it, but this jumbo jet came from the factory founded in 1917 by another man of German descent, William Edward Boeing, who was born as Wilhelm Eduard Boeing, whose father, Wilhelm Boeing, originally from Hohenlimburg, emigrated to the United States of America in 1868. There he married Marie Ottmann, who was also of German descent, the mother of Wilhelm Eduard, who was then born in Detroit in 1881. In addition to the gentleman and the two ladies introduced in the opening credits, there is also John Swigert, who was of German descent, derived from Schweigart, who in April 1970 flew as the command module pilot of Apollo 13, together with the lunar module pilot Fred Heise, who also had German roots and was supposed to become the 6th person to be brought to the moon. However, the mission had to be aborted beforehand. The film Apollo 13 recalls the dramatic minutes in the capsule. And finally, the German-descended Harrison Schmitt, who, on December 11, 1972, became the last person to set foot on the moon to this day, and then hopped around singing there with his colleague Eugene Cernan. If you objectively consider the significant contribution of German scientists and astronauts to the conquest of the moon, including Christian Morgenstern's observation regarding German script, one can only come to the approving and logical conclusion. Following this, the satellite became a completely German object. Finally, I would like to remind you of two Germans who deserve the same recognition as all the cosmonauts and astronauts before them. Of the former Major General of the National People's Army of the German Democratic Republic, Siegmund Werner Paul Jaehn, who passed away on September 21, 2019, and who, on August 26, 1978, flew into space as the first German in the Soviet space capsule, Soyuz 31.